podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 14th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 30th, 2026. And I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited. Here we are. It's amazing that we are already to the end of August, but yet it's still, again, this growing season. I keep reiterating on this, and I keep going back to this because I do think this is such a vital aspect. And if long as we keep this mentality of growth, I think it really helps us as we get further down the line here and start moving into some bigger topics, and we start rolling over the year as we move into the year of Mark here by the end of the calendar year. But it's one of these moments where we have to continue to build that habit. It's really easy in the summer months to be busy with all these other things, and then that just continues to roll and roll and roll again. So this idea that we're building this habit of continuing to get into the Word, I think is really important and very important skill for us to continue to be pondering and working on. Speaking of pondering, let's go to the question that we had for last week, which was, what is something so small and easy to overlook, but is vital to a community? We had a couple different responses this week, and I thought they were really good. First and foremost, we had children, the voice of children, and how easy it is, especially as adults, to overlook what they're saying, overlook what they're seeing, overlook things, and not take them as credible sources. But yet, there's plenty of times because they look at the world differently. They haven't necessarily been trained to look at things in a specific way. It allows them to notice and point out details that are vital, and it helps us continue to remind ourselves of that self. And remember, Jesus said, let the little children come to me, not let the adults come to me. The second one I got was a really interesting comment, and I think it's pondering and getting into something else I've been thinking about a little bit as well. And this person's comment was talking about how vital it is for communities to have music, specifically live music. And this person kind of got into and talking about how you used to have a lot of like community bands and things of that nature, and how a lot of that has kind of dwindled off. And I would argue some of this, I think, is one of the problems I think that's starting to be systemic, at least here in the United States, is this idea of efficiency, and everything has to be perfectly efficient. And if you're doing something that isn't causing you to make money or moving you towards something like that, what are you doing it for? And I think in that, it loses the vitality of also having fun. And I think a lot of times music can help inspire that, inspire creativity. And if we lose this aspect of fun within business, within life, within communities, I think it really deteriorates what we have experienced before. It leaves us desiring and wanting more and being able to get more out of life. And yet, then we can't because we don't have the creativity. We've sucked so much of that out because we're looking for efficiency. And I think that's something as a world that we really need to look at, consider, and contemplate as we are continuing to move forward is efficiency the goal, or is the goal creativity and fun and things of that nature, which I think helps us go deeper also scripturally into our text. Speaking of our text this week, let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts that we can have this week is out of Exodus chapter 3, the first 15 verses of it. This is, again, continuing on that story of Moses, and this is a fairly familiar text of the burning bush with Moses. But we have to remember what is going on here with Moses. Moses is out keeping flocks for his father-in-law. The Lord appears to him in a bush, and the flames do not consume the bush. And yet then we get this reminder for Moses to come closer, but to take off his sandals, that he is on holy ground. And God then reminds him, I have seen my people. I'm seeing the misery that's going on in Egypt. I want you to go and get my people out of Egypt. And I find it kind of funny where Moses is like, with all due respect, what are you expecting me to do? Just go up to the Pharaoh and be like, hey, we're going to have our Israelites leave, peace out, no problem. And that really doesn't work, and so God is stating, no, I'll be with you. And then Moses kind of also comes back with, how are the people going to trust me? He's remembering there is an incident that he does when he was working for the Pharaoh that ended up killing some Israelites, and that's kind of how he gets to this position to begin with. And God responds with, I am who I am. Just respond to the Israelites that I am have sent you. And so this aspect of God encouraging Moses, I will be with you. Don't worry about it. I know this is an unexpected source for you and for them, but I'm still going to be with you and guide you through it. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 105, the first 6 verses of it, 23 through 26 and 45b. This then is this recognition on, one, making known the works and things that God is doing and making sure that God's name is rejoiced. And that we then continue to seek that out, looking for God, remembering what God has done, remembering the times and what God has done for God's offspring, and thus being able to deliver the people out. We then also get where we start getting into like verse 23 and go even a little bit before when we started talking about verse 6 here too, the recognition of what God has done before and recognizing and reminding that there was Moses, there was Aaron, this idea of how they were able to work together to bring forward what God is stating. And even though people were hard and crafty and menacing at times, the God still prevailed and brought them through. The other Old Testament text this week is out of Jeremiah chapter 15, starting at verse 15 through 21. This is this moment where the prophet Jeremiah is kind of questioning a little bit on what am I supposed to do? The people aren't necessarily excited for what I have to do, but it's also this moment of where Jeremiah is kind of going back and forth and remembering what has been done before and how God has continued to deliver them, even though this is not necessarily easy what God is asking him to do. And is kind of stating like, when is all this going to come to an end? Like, this is difficult. This is hard. I don't want to be doing this. And yet God will continue to be with me. God will continue to steer me, and God will continue to prevail even if I am worried and concerned about what is going to happen. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 26, the first 8 verses of that. And again, this is this recognition starting right away in verse 1 of who God is with the integrity of what God has done. And thus being able to trust that and trusting the steadfast love and recognizing all these different ways in which God has continued to provide, God has continued to be there, God has continued to help, even when there has been doubt, even though there has been times where there is uneasiness, that still God is there and guiding you and helping you through. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Romans chapter 12, starting at verse 9 to 21. And this then is kind of continuing in this idea of what should we be doing then with our neighbors? That we're wanting genuine love. We're wanting to make sure that we have mutual affection for each other, that we are recognizing the hope that is in people and recognizing how we can come together and work together and recognizing that, yes, there's going to be times that people are persecuting, but this is also sometimes for us to continue to remind us on who the people are that we should be associating with closer. And it doesn't mean that we don't hear it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't cause us to reflect, but it's also not a moment where we turn around in anger. This is a moment that we recognize the wisdom of what God has continued to do, and we handle things peaceably. And this is a moment where we make sure that our quote-unquote enemies, that we're treating them better, and recognizing that in doing this and treating them in ways that they don't expect, it's hard for them to continue on with that evil spouting if you turn things around in a way they aren't expecting. The gospel text this week is out of Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 21 through 28. This starts off, I think, really hot, and I think it's really important because there's a lot that's condensed in the first 3 verses here. Jesus is talking about how he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. Peter then takes him aside. Forbid it, Lord, this should never happen to you. Cool the jets. You don't need to do this. Verse 23, get behind me, Satan, is what Jesus says to Peter. You are a hindrance to me. You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And then we get into this whole thing on what is God desiring versus what we're desiring. And recognizing that God has continued to provide and God has continued to be there and sometimes working in ways that we don't expect. And yet that's the way that God is wanting us to work, instead of necessarily having our predetermined and our pre-understood things and saying, this is the way that it's supposed to be, and thus this is the way that I will go. And it's the reminder here in verse 28. Very truly I tell you, there are some standing here that will not taste death before seeing the Son of Man coming into his kingdom. What Jesus is talking about is hard for them to understand and comprehend at this time. But yet, as being on this side of the cross and knowing where this is going, we can recognize and understand that what Jesus was talking about. And this recognition then within our own lives, when there's moments where this doesn't seem possible, this doesn't seem good, this seems unobtainable, it's this reminder that God's going to still continue to be there with us and help guide us through these different situations. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction, ways to be thinking about these texts, along with hearing it from some great biblical scholars, along with just the great commentaries and archives of data that's really right there at your fingertips. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with having art, prayers, liturgical colors and hymns, daily readings to get you into these texts. It's such a vital thing to be able to help prepare you for whenever your worship service is. Get into these texts. Keep going. Dig that little bit deeper. Prepare your mind so that when those sermons come, when those homilies comes, it allows you to go that much deeper because you have heard it recently. You've gone through the text. You've started to do some more of that additional study. It's amazing how much deeper and how much more you can pull out of these texts when you do that. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that as well. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. These are either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies within the weekly lectionary, along with having some additional events, event notices, and some additional green notes, if you want to put it that way, things to be thinking about from a more of an ecological perspective. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out Esong Nadali Teddy's article, Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet. It's the second link down in the references section, and it's a great place, especially if you've been going through the faith and science debate and discussion for years, or you're just dipping your toes in. It's a great foundational piece. If you haven't checked this article out, I'd highly recommend it. It's amazing at being able to help start to lay that foundation of saying, no, science and scripture work together instead of working in competition. So if you have questions or things that you're wondering about, that is the place that I would start when you're starting to look into the faith and science discussion. So I'd highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Esong Nadali Teddy. That'll be the second link down in the references section. It's amazing when we start thinking about it and we start seeing it this way, from the Romans text on how we're supposed to treat people who are persecuting us, to what Jesus says to his disciple, especially Peter, coming off of what happened last week, to what we have with Moses here. And Moses, there's a lot of discussion within scholarly debates on, was there a stutter? There was obviously some stage fright in some form or fashion for Moses to be leading these people, which we'll get into kind of further later on how Aaron then kind of helps Moses. But this recognition on how God then surprises even Moses here, now with a bush that's being consumed by fire, but is not engulfed in flame. This recognition on how God continues to show up and do things in ways that we would not expect. And it kind of gets back to the question that we even had this last week of the things that we overlook, the things we don't expect, that they have great value. There's a great one that I know I've never really touched on or had a whole episode about, and I was kind of looking through and trying to think about this, and I think this is worth a little bit of a discussion about. And today we're going to talk about the amazing life of Edward Benedictus, who unintentionally has created something that impacts your life on a daily basis, most of us. And without it, I think the world would be a much different place than what we have today. And how the story goes is in 1903, a French chemist, Edward Benedictus, who dabbled in lots of other things, music and bookbinding and art, but he was cleaning up his lab, and a glass flask fell to the floor and broke, but did not shatter. Now, it's a glass flask. We all know what happens when glass hits the floor. It shatters. But in this case, it didn't. And there's a little bit of debate back and forth. Was it like a lab hand or something that they had been working on earlier? They were starting to work with what ended up being like early plastics, that they were taking treated cotton with a mixture of sulfuric and nitric acid. And that together made a solvent that lined the inside of this flask. And even as they had tried to clean it, it wasn't necessarily done super well. And so thus, this broke, shattered, but it didn't fall apart. It stayed together. It stayed intact. Now, this wasn't this like amazing, immediate breakthrough. In fact, it's something that kind of just sat in the back of the mind and, okay, cool. And Benedictus went on to other things and made note of how it looked really cool, especially as an artist, that you had like these prisms and such suddenly being created in the glass. That all kind of changed with World War I, where suddenly this quote-unquote safety glass or triplex became something of desired, and it was seen as something that was an extremely expensive process to be able to do. And so thus, it really took its first major application in 1909 to be used for gas masks for World War I. But based off of what that had happened and being able to figure out ways to make the process easier and easier, that allowed for then in the 1920s, a lot of American automobile companies to suddenly be getting into this, also with a little bit of like motivation from Benedictus as well. This idea, especially at this point, we have to remember the automobile is new. It is allowing humans to travel at speeds they've never traveled before. And thus, when we had plate glass, one of the things that was starting to happen is when accidents were happening, you're getting the quote-unquote broken necklace, where people were going through the glass, and that was kind of the final killing, if you want to put it that way, because of the amount of vital organs that are especially right there in the neck that are necessary for us to survive. Now, as this started to be adopted, there was definitely changes that started to become possible and started to happen, especially with what they were using, the cellulose nitrate that was this plastic that was holding this together. They decided in the 30s to start changing that out because it was cellulose and it was yellowing with age with the sunlight. So they went to a synthetic resin of vinyl butyl that kind of holds these together. Now, what's really happening is think of it kind of as a glass sandwich per se. You have glass on one side, you have this resin or some type of synthetic binding agent, so vinyl butyl in this case, and another piece of glass on the other side. And what that's doing is then when you have a break, it's because of that resin, it's holding everything in place. And we can think about this like when you get a crack in your windshield and it doesn't go all the way through, you can't feel it on the one side. Or when you do have an impact of some nature that the glass all holds there, on the one side you'll feel it, the other side it's smooth because again that resin in between is holding those two pieces together. Now, when we think about and look at this story and how this has come to be and how vital this has become. Safety glass was the early predecessor to tempered glass. And most of us who are listening to this podcast carry a piece of tempered glass around with us every single day as your small computing device of a phone of some nature has tempered glass on the outside. And it's that same type of idea. Again, there's been evolution and changes to make it stronger and harder and more scratch resistant, and that's a whole nother thing in and of itself. But the early predecessors come back to this, and it all comes back to a flask being bumped off the table and acting in a way that wasn't expected. Think about these texts now from that lens. Jesus is laying out what Jesus is going to do. It's not what the disciples or anybody would have guessed is what needs to be done. It doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem natural. It seems counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. But yet, being on this side of the cross, we understand why it was so vital and how important it was that it was done that way. The Romans text is the same idea. We're taking whatever the persecution is and how people are looking at you and how people are saying things. And yes, there might be truth there, but don't then take that and say, vengeance is mine and repay it. No, instead, repay them with what they need. If they are hungry, give them food. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. Don't pour and have that fire burn within you. Instead, repay it with kindness. Instead, surprise them and do something that they are not expecting. Jeremiah still goes through with what God is telling him to do, but he still has questions. These people, what are they doing? Why do I have to keep doing this? The pain of what this is doing, but I don't want to turn my back on what God is telling me to do. Moses still goes through, even though scared, worried about how people are going to interpret him, worried about how Pharaoh's going to interpret him. But yet, God's still there. God still ends up working. And as we will continue to go through here, God takes care of Moses quite well. Within our own lives, we start creating these boxes, or we start putting in our limitations, or we hold this vengeance and say that we need to handle it. I know myself, I do that plenty. There's plenty of times where I feel like I just need to solve the solution. And instead, when am I giving things to God and just trusting that God's got it, even though it may seem irrational to me? It doesn't make sense to me. I think there's a lot of times that we put ourselves into these boxes. And when we're in these boxes, it's really easy for us to let the coals and things sit in these boxes. And what does that do? It just burns the box. And that provides fuel for them to continue to chip away, essentially keep those embers burning. But that's not what we're told to do. I think we're all susceptible to this. But the problem is with that is that it doesn't allow us to be surprised, because we are allowing and we're saying this is the way that it's going to be. We're coming in with preconceptions and not allowing ourselves to have our mind refreshed by something different. When we kill with kindness, it allows us to actually be open to hearing what other people have to say, because we're worried more about them than our own selves. And whatever they're saying, we're just not letting it get to a place where it's going to burn within us. It doesn't mean that we don't still listen to it. It doesn't mean that we can't get constructive criticism from it. If we stay so preoccupied on where we are at this moment, there's too much that we end up missing. I know one other example that my wife and I know have experienced with this is I remember early on in our marriage, there was just some stuff that happens, with early marriage stuff. And I remember we had tracked the budget pretty well that year. And I remember we came out of the year feeling better about the year than the way we gone in financially. And when we looked at the numbers didn't make sense. There were these crazy, unexpected expenses that had come up, but yet God had continued to show up and take care of things in unexpected ways, making for it to be easier in certain ways than we had expected. I think this kind of ties a little bit back to last week, where sometimes we get so preoccupied that we miss What are small things that can help us open our mind up to new ways of thinking about things? When Benedictus saw this article talking about the accidents and people dying from the plate glass of the time, and yes, there had been some uses of his safety glass to that point, but it was also then recognizing, no, there's something here, there's something I went through and experienced years ago that might be of use here. Has it been innovated on and continued to be worked on? Of course. But it's also then allowing him to recognize that it wasn't a mistake. Who knows what that initial experiment was actually trying to do? It may have been unsuccessful, but yet they still were able to figure something out. We have to remember that God's way and our way don't always perfectly align. And it's easy for us to have those embers burn. It's hard to put out that fire, and it's necessary at times. So my question that I have for you this week is, where have you been surprised with something where God showed up and surprised you? Where has been a place where God has surprised you? Where has been a place that God has surprised you? I think we need to hear these stories more. I think we need to recognize that we sometimes make science out to be this very professional, very specific. We had a good hypothesis and we proved it. And there's a lot of that does happen. But don't also throw the baby out with the bathwater in the aspect and saying this is all perfectly scripted. Heck no. There's no way that it is. Plenty of times where God does things, surprises us. The experiment doesn't go the way that we expect, and it's something else. There's plenty of examples of it. Heck, there's whole industries that have been made off of mistakes that people made. I think that's one of the things that we need to continue to remember within life. Mistakes happen, and that allows us to move forward and allows us to understand that we aren't supposed to take everything perfectly serious either. Sometimes we're just meant to have some fun too. Peter is very concerned about Jesus and what Peter is starting to see what Jesus can become. Peter doesn't understand the true purpose of what God had sent Jesus to do. Peter was trying to make it from a more of a business perspective, a business decision. Jesus is saying that's not why I'm here. Sometimes what appear to be the mistakes, what appears to be what are you doing, are sometimes the most important things within our lives. And who would have guessed that bumping a flask in a lab would end up saving lives of hundreds of thousands through safety glass, and heck, be carrying it around with us on a daily basis, a new version of it. You never know where your mistakes are going to lead you, but also then don't prevent other people from achieving where they need to go as well. It's part of the growing process, and it's hard to always navigate, but it's necessary in this life. Sometimes we have to bump a flask and get scared that it's going to shatter and have a huge mess, and we end up finding something greater than we ever could have imagined out of a mistake of a broken flask. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.